My name is Kai Mortenhagen. I'm IAASB board member and chair of the Audit of Less Complex Entities Task Force. In this short video, I'll walk you through the exciting new draft standard for audits of less complex entities that has just been released for public comment. I'm excited to speak about the proposed standard that has been developed to be responsive to the challenges relating to complexity and difficulties in applying the ISAs faced by those auditing LCEs. Now, we need your feedback, and to help you understand the thinking behind the standard, I will briefly explain how we developed the standard and highlight some areas where we need further input from you. To start off, I will explain the fundamental basis of the standard. This standard is designed to be a separate standalone standard. It is an alternative to the ISAs for audits of financial statements of less complex entities, and it will be up to each individual country about whether and how it's adopted. The ISA for LCE has been designed to achieve reasonable assurance, just like an audit using the full set of ISAs. We have focused on the core procedures of an audit and have included those so that the auditor is able to consistently perform quality audit engagements. The standard has been designed to be proportionate to the typical nature and circumstances of an audit on an LCE. In other words, it only contains requirements that would be relevant for a less complex audit. It is not designed for complex matters and circumstances, and so does not have requirements to address them. The authority section of the standard and the supplemental guide to the authority further explains complexity for the purpose of using the standard. So, when can the ISA for LCE be used? This diagram reflects how the decisions are made in deciding when to use the standard. We call this the authority of the standard, and it's a separate part up front. It explains when the standard is appropriate to use, both for jurisdictions wanting to adopt the standard and firms and practitioners, either when setting policies and procedures or for using on specific audit engagements. Firstly, the standard is prohibited from being used under any circumstances for certain types of entities. In the authority, these are set out as specific prohibitions, and it's currently proposed that the standard cannot be used for audits of listed entities, for group audits, or for entities with public interest characteristics. The category entities with public interest characteristics can, however, be modified by jurisdictions according to their own circumstances, and the authority and the supplemental guide explain when this may be appropriate. The other two categories, audits of listed entities and group audits, were always prohibitions and cannot be modified. Standard can also not be used in jurisdiction if that jurisdiction prohibits the use of the standard or requires another set of standard to be used. Local jurisdictions. In addition to the ability to modify certain categories, local bodies with standard setting authority may create further restrictions on when the standard can be used. For example, they may also add a quantitative threshold. For example, it may not be used on an audit if an entity with a certain amount of revenue or number of employees. Firms should be creating their own policies and procedures for use of the standard. For example, the firm may want to further restrict use of the standard because of a certain risk profile of its clients. However, firms cannot override prohibitions within the standard or further restrictions set by local jurisdictions. Engagement partners for a specific engagement. If the audit is permitted to use the standard after the considerations I have already spoken about, the engagement partner must still evaluate if the standard is appropriate for use for that specific engagement. This evaluation is based on the description of qualitative characteristics explained in the authority. For example, if the entity has a complex IT system consisting of various interrelated systems that are highly customized and highly integrated, then the standard would not be appropriate, as procedures designed to address these more complex areas are not included in the standard. The auditor makes an initial assessment during this acceptance continuance of an engagement, and there is a standback built into the standard to check that the initial assessment is still correct once the auditor has completed the planning activities and identified and assessed risk material misstatements. During the audit, the auditor should also be thinking about the decision to use the standard if new information that the auditor wasn't expecting comes up. The broad fundamental concepts on which the standard is based are set out on this slide. The standard has been designed for an audit using a risk-based approach, same as the ISAs, and based on underlying concepts and, where relevant, the core requirements from the ISAs. It has been written to be principle-based with a focus on the expected output of a requirement, i.e. focused on what the outcome of the requirement that the auditor needs to achieve. The requirement has been written to be understandable, clear, and concise, avoiding any unnecessary words, repetition, or ambiguous language. As you'll see in the standard, there is some but limited application material that we call essential explanatory material. This has been included to the extent we believe it's necessary to provide essential context for the understanding of a concept or a requirement. The EM, as we call it, does not contain examples in the same way as the ISAs do. It is intended that an implementation guide will be developed and that it will include examples. Within the standard, the EM is distinguished from the requirements by being in blue boxes and being presented in italics. Moving on to the standard itself. The standard has been structured to follow the flow of an audit, starting with the more general principles of an audit in parts 1 to 3, and followed by the procedural requirements for an audit of an LCE in parts 4 to 9. Parts 1 to 3 explain the fundamental concepts and overarching principles, general requirements on audit evidence and documentation, responsibilities for managing and achieving quality. Parts 4 to 9 include the requirements relevant to the acceptance continuance of the audit engagement, the planning through the concluding and reporting phases of the audit. All this is preceded by a preface, which explains the responsibilities of the auditor and management and explains how the IAASB will maintain the standard, how we will update it once we are updating the ISAs themselves. The individual part contains all the requirements relevant for that part and is not topic specific like the ISAs. Therefore, for example, each of the procedural parts, 4 to 9, will contain the specific documentation and communication requirements relevant to the procedures in that part. Each part is structured the same way, with introductory material broadly explaining the content of the part, the objective of the part, and the necessary requirements. The requirements have been drafted in such a way that it's intended to make it easy to follow and clear for users of the standard. The draft standard has now been released for a public comment on the IAASB website. With the standard is also an explanatory memorandum that explains how we developed the standard, some of the key decisions made when developing the standard, as well as specific questions we want feedback on. As this is new for IAASB, there are a number of specific areas where we're still looking for feedback that will help us as we finalize the standard next year. Some of the more significant areas where we're looking for feedback are presented on this slide. We want to hear your views on the standard and the content itself. What is included and what was not included? Is it appropriate for the types of audits it is designed for? And can it and will it be used? Feedback on the flow and the structure of the standard will also be helpful, as well as the proposed title, the name of the standard. We also want your feedback on the authority. In other words, who can use the standard and who it's designed for. For the relevant standard setting bodies in a local jurisdiction, we want to know if the approach we have taken to where decisions made is workable and whether there are any other obstacles to adoption of the standard. In particular, we want feedback on whether the decision to exclude procedure for audits of group is appropriate, and if we do decide to include group audits, how that should be done. Other areas where we seek feedback is on what transition and implementation guidance would be useful when rolling out the standard once it's finalized, including expected challenges and barriers to implementation. These are not the only questions we want feedback on. Feedback on any matters related to the standard would be welcome. not just related to the specific questions. The deadline for comment is January 31st, 2022, and comments can be submitted on the IAASB website. We will also be undertaking outreach later in 2021 and early 2022 on this draft standard. So keep watching our website for news on what we will be doing in your area. Welcome and encourage comments from anyone that may be affected by this standard. Users of financial statements, regulators, local bodies, practitioners, and others. As this proposed standard is responsive to the challenge expressed by those auditing LCs relating to the complexity and difficulties in applying the ISAs, we now need your feedback on the proposed standard and the questions, and I encourage you to use the opportunity to share your feedback. Looking forward to receiving your feedback on this important topic. Thank you.